improving the test guideline process. And in many ways, there is parts of the process that are just set in policy. And as we'll go through, there are several phases to the bits that people as scientists or reviewers are in charge of keeping moving as fast as possible. Those are the bits we're going to try and cover within these 5 webinars that we'll have about the different phases of the process, right from inception of we need a test guideline to the test guideline is ratified and is now being used by industry. Today's webinar is about how do we use a test guideline that is already out there? How do we find that we struggle to use it? And is there things we could bear in mind when making test guidelines that would make them more applicable in the sort of use phase afterwards? So without any further details, we'll move into the program for today. We have a round table of experts, which is the format we've chosen. It's a little bit untried and untested, but we're hoping we can work our way through it. So we picked, and very grateful to have experts from several fields of the use phase of a standard or guideline. Some of the consultants that work with industry to then commission tests to be done to meet evidence requirements for dossiers and product registrations. The other people that are here are Amaya from Geica and Ricky from Necotox or Necotox, who are the laboratory service providers. So the people that will pick up the guideline and run the tests. And then there's Karen from BSAF, who obviously is big enough to do a lot of this stuff in-house. So we're hoping to have everybody covered. And I think we have at least Kai from Blue Frog and Joanne from Virail. I'll let you introduce it yourself later. I'm not sure whether Neil's turned up yet. I can't see him in the list. But
I'm here.
You're there. I can see you now. Yeah, thanks. When you speak, you jump up to the front. Good. So if you just each want to spend a minute saying what your background is. I'm from CEH. I'm an ecotoxicologist, so I usually am involved in the why don't we do the test this way phase, and then getting frustrated when the reviewers come back and say, well, that we don't think that makes sense. We'd rather have you did it this way. So Neil, if you want to go first, just really quickly, what your role is with the use phase of standards.
Hi, yeah, my name's Neil Hunt. I work for Yordas, who are a consultancy on chemical regulations based in Lancaster in the UK. Also got sites in Germany and Canada. We generally have clients, industrial clients, quite often small and medium-sized enterprises, and we support them with all of their regulatory obligations. As Klaus said, a lot of commissioning studies, but before that, doing data gap analysis and doing designing testing strategies, IATAs, to go and ensure that all the regulatory obligations are covered, but in as a economically advantageous way as possible for our clients.
Good.
I'm a chemist by training, but I've done a lot of toxicology and ecotox in the last 10 years.
Excellent, thank you. So it might be Kai we're missing in numbers then. Is it Kai, are you here? I can only see the first 15 now. No, so Kai Paul will turn up from Blue Frog Scientific. Very much their specialist in nano and nano registration for dossiers there. Kai's an ecotoxicologist when he gets here. So Joanne, do you want to just run through quickly again?
Yes, Joanne Shatkin, and it's Vireo Advisors. I'm based in Boston, but we're international. We work in North America and across the globe on safety demonstration of new and emerging and advanced materials and technologies, both in the nano and biospace. And you know, we find that our niche is really about understanding how to use existing safety methods for new materials. And so this discussion is squarely in our wheelhouse, because that's our area of focus. How do we do that to the satisfaction of regulators and other stakeholders?
Brilliant.
I'm an environmental health scientist by training.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, great to have the US perspective in here as well, because the thing with the OECD standards is obviously they don't just fit to our European legislation, they have to cover everything. So yeah, thank you for being here and being up early. Amaya and Ricky, if you want to go through what kind of tests you provide and what your experience is, that would be great. Amaya first.
Yes, hi, hello everybody. Well, GAICE, we are a technological center. We are located in the north of Spain. And we, as you said, we are the ones who perform the assays under any guideline. We work with nanomaterials, but we also work with other products like pharma products or cosmetics or food and feed. So I think we can have the differences between both types of assays that we have to perform.
Excellent, thank you. And Ricky?
Yes, hello. So basically I'm an ecotoxicologist, but also have a background in analytics. And Ecotox is a lab providing studies for nanomaterials specifically. So we do mainly the studies which are important for nanomaterials, which are really different from studies we had for other materials until now, like dissolution rate and dispersion stability, particle size distribution, and things like that. And yeah, for all kind of nanomaterials you can imagine, so from inorganic to organic, with all types of shape and so on. So we have quite some experience also from materials, of course, which are maybe not in the focus of guidelines under development. So I think it's important to keep in mind what is on the market and what needs to be tested with a guideline after it is published. Yeah. So that maybe I can help with some insights from this point.
Yeah, that's what today's all about. Thank you. And Karin, if you want to cover the wide basis of BASF, that would be great.
Okay, I'm Karin Binsch. I'm working for BASF in Ludwigshafen in Germany. I'm a regulatory toxicologist, and within BASF, I think we have a big group of regulatory toxicologists. Beside this, we also have experimental toxicology and ecotoxicology, also analytics. And with this, we just accompany all the regulatory needs we have to do globally for chemicals, for plant protection products, biocides, but also for nanomaterials and particles. And BASF is already very much engaged in the research, safety research of nanomaterials. It started, I think, 2004, when we just started with our work on safety testing of nanomaterials. And so we are also very much involved in a lot of research projects. And we're doing this mainly in toxicology, but also in ecotox. And now it's more and more coming that we are doing a lot of work in the FISCAM, on the FISCAM parameter.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. So that's the panel. I will now hand on to Sean, who's going to go through how we'll do this. And obviously the panel will be asked to speak. But if the rest of you have comments you want to make, please put them in the chat and we'll monitor the chat as we go through each of the phases. But there is also a Mentimeter bit to this, which Sean will introduce you to now.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks ever so much, Klaus. So first of all, on the Mentimeter, to respond to questions as they come up, you need to go to www.menti.com and input the code 3150492. That code will appear at the top of every slide where there's a question asked, so you can always find the code as you need it. I'll also copy it and put it in the chat before I finish the conversation, before I finish talking here, so that you can all access it from the chat as well.
And you can just keep that open either on another device or in a web page on the side. It can stay open for the whole meeting.
Indeed. So before we move on to sort of asking some questions, it's more just to bring everyone up to speed and say a little bit about NanoHarmony and what the actual project's trying to do and how this webinar fits in. So NanoHarmony aims to help develop and validate some new test methods for the OECD test guidelines, to also create a network that allows us to interact with all the relevant stakeholders, and finally to develop a structure that will help better translate science into new test methods that can be used in conjunction to comply with regulations. So coming out of the project, we're hoping to have both some existing new and adapted OECD test guidelines. We're hoping to improve the cooperation between scientists, industry, standardization bodies such as the OECD, and indeed regulators. And the eventual aim really is to have faster implementation of scientific results into regulation. So test guidelines are obviously a response to a regulatory need. They support the uptake of new and complex methods by producing relevant and sufficient guidance on how to test and interpret data and to use those in reporting via templates. It's to create harmonized testing methodologies that are robust and reliable for government agencies and bodies to base their decisions upon, bearing in mind animal welfare considerations, also mindful of the economic implications of testing, so trying to find testing routes that are economically useful and actually able to be used by companies, and to make them as broadly accessible as possible. OECD member countries are the ones that agree through consensus process the final test guidelines and guidance developments. And as Klaus said earlier, it's important to realise that this is not just the EU, but it's much broader than the EU, and it's also not necessarily just developed countries either. So it's important to bear in mind that some of the test guidelines have to be accessible to countries with poorer economies. So on the screen is just the test guidelines that are currently being worked upon inside NanoHarmony. These fall into human and ecotoxicity test guidelines and also some phys-chem characterization test guidelines. So there's a total of 6 test guidelines being worked upon within the project. And as you'll see on the next slide, they're all currently at various stages of the OECD process. Looking at what we're trying to do in the webinars here, the aim here is to really look at the different phases that a test guideline will pass through, from the initial idea for a test guideline at phase 0, through to its proposal and the SPSF phase, through to technical development, commenting and approval, and what we're focusing upon here is its actual use in industry. We decided to start at phase 4 for the webinars series so that we could look at how test guidelines are used in industry, and then also how these then get fed back into phase 0 for initial ideas for new test guidelines. And here I will hand over to Karen, who will say some words on the requirements for an OECD test guideline.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Within BASF, I think we have a big advantage, since we are a quite big company, that we just have every stage of a test guideline already tested in-house. So we are just within the development that we develop of test guidelines. We use test guidelines experimentally, and also we use them for regulatory purpose. for the interpretation. And therefore, in advance to this webinar, I sat together with my colleagues from the different units, and we discussed what might be the prerequisites for an acceptance and use of an OECD test guidelines. And in the first step, it's really the technical phase that you have to be sure which data requirement is needed. Then you really have to make sure that there is a proof of concept, and what is especially very important later on, especially for in vitro tests, that that you can use them according to good in vitro method practice, to the guidance, OECD guidance document, but also under GLP, and you have valid data interpretation procedures. A test has to be predictive. It has to be sensitive. It has to have a specificity, and it has to be reproducible. Independent of the lab, you have to get the same results, so it has to be precise, and you have to know when is a test out of domain. It's more and more happening that really there are classes of chemicals which cannot be used for within a test guideline because they might be too irritant, too cytotoxic, or other effects. So this is something what you really have to recognize in advance and also within the test guidelines. And also we have to discuss if you develop a test guideline, are the resources generally available? These are biological samples, reagents, controls, reference substance. Is the equipment available broadly? Are there licenses needed to perform this test? I think this already happened in the past, that I think usually OECD is not accepting guidelines where you need a license. So these are more the technical requirements you have to discuss, and then you have to really to see these caveats. And I discussed it really with Robert Lanzi, my colleague from the experimental part, and he said, you really always should have an interlaboratory test, so-called round-robin test, which is validating the test guideline. And within this round-robin test, you get the knowledge if your test system is robust, and that it's getting you precise outcome independent of the labs you're using it. So this is really, the validation is a very, very important step. And although this is an advice that he gave to me, that if you want to have a robust test guideline, within the complexity of the test, it's getting that you're losing the robustness. So I think that within the acceptance process, if you have a very complex model, there is a higher likelihood that you may fail with this. And on the next slide, I really see it from the point of regulation. This is more my expertise, that I really have to make sure what endpoint, regulatory endpoint, is this guideline addressing. And since we are more dealing with alternative methods, we have to see, is this endpoint addressed comprehensively, or is it only an event in an AOP or a mode of action? And if it's only one event, is there other methods available complementing this AOP or mode of action? And I think, which I already mentioned before, is there interpretation procedure available based on these results? And the next question is, can I use this tests for classification and labeling? I think this is what we usually do with those tests. And can I use it also for deriving a no effect level, from which I later on then derive a derived no effect level, which is used for the risk assessment, or a PNAC, which is the counterpart in the ecotoxicology. And the other question is, do I have a quantitative or a qualitative outcome of the test? If it is only qualitative, only looking for the hazard, or then I only can tell something out of about the test and cannot use it for the risk assessment. For the risk assessment, I also need a quantitative assessment determining the potency. Another aspect which I should also look at the test guideline, can I derive a threshold level? And I think especially this is very important for in vitro tests. And since we are talking about nanomaterials, there are also, we are dealing with a lot, at least in Europe, with nanoforms of a nanomaterial. So we have various forms of a nanomaterial from one chemical identity. And then it's very important, can we use this test also for read across, and how can we get this data into a grouping concept like the ETHOTOC Nano app, which is, for example, used in Europe. So these are more the introductory remarks from my side.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Karen, for that useful background for everybody. So we're on the same page about what they have to achieve in terms of standards and being employed. So the aims of today really is, from the NanoHarmony perspective, to go through and identify the challenges and barriers to how guidelines that are out there are being used in industry. We'll have to look at, is it because they are too complex, or because they are too expensive, or whatever those barriers could be. Once we have a final guideline, it obviously should be as useful as it possibly could be. Otherwise, we have to change how we design them slightly. We need to get feedback from all the stakeholders. That includes the panel, but also all the rest of you. So feel free to use the chat to enter comments that you want to make, and we'll pull you up in order as we go through. It's really about using all of this and the other webinars we've already held and will be holding to deliver a legacy that NanoHarmony will leave behind, to try and establish what are the best ways of building a guideline right from the initial idea of that phase 0 through the OECD process. How do we make things go as efficiently and smoothly and quickly as we can within that process, so it doesn't need to take 10 years from we realize we need a standard to we have one that is ratified and taken up by the service providers. It's providing that feedback back into the OECD process. So one of the things Sean mentioned was NanoHarmony works with multiple projects along the side. One of them is NanoMet, which is run by the OECD alongside, in terms of how do they change and smooth out the process on their side for the future test guidelines. And it's about bringing together those different stakeholder groups and finding environments that we can do that in to improve how we get that test guideline development process as fast as we can. Next slide, Sean. So the structure of today is split into 4 main themes. We are getting to about where Sean and I predicted we would have a quarter of an hour for each of them. We think 2 might take a little bit longer than the others, but we'll try and manage around 15 minutes and then we can go back if we end up with spare time. We'll allow this to be done via Mentimeter, so everybody can build a picture of what the full 65, 66 people here have in terms of feelings around the issues that we're going to discuss. And then we'll go through some slides that the panel have prepared for each of those phases, or each of those elements. As we've said, it's going to be recorded, or is being recorded, and we'll make it available on YouTube channel through the NanoHarmony website, as we do generally with the webinars. There'll also be a follow-up survey distributed where we can pick up feedback and further input later. So keep notes of whatever it is you have that you want to say that either doesn't fit in time or within the Mentimeter. So the 4 things we're going to run through now is understanding how to implement newly generated test guidelines, then the availability and the cost of the current recommended tests that are out there, specifically thinking about nano, of course, and then in 3, really thinking about that in terms of, are there test guidelines for all the requirements that are out there that you meet or that your customers meet, both now and going forward in terms of developments that we can either see coming or that are coming, but will have elements within it that we haven't got standards to measure yet or provide the evidence for. And then fourth would be, how would industry be able to encourage new tests to be developed if and when that's needed, and how do we do that best? And that's, as Sean said, about feeding the current use phase back into that phase 0 of what science is it that needs to be moved into the start of the OECD guideline chain. Next slide, please. And I think this is over to you again, Sean.
Yeah, it's just a quick question to make sure that everyone's on the Mentimeter and using it. If everyone could please use using the 2-letter country code, just say which country they're based in, and this should hopefully form a nice little word cloud as we go along. And I'll just bring up the voting instructions again for those who have just joined us or those who didn't manage to get them earlier. If you go to menti.com and then enter the code 3150492, or quickly use the QR code that's on the screen, you will be able to vote and we can then record those votes. I'll just leave this up for 2 seconds for people to get that, and then I'll sort of switch back to the results.
Good. And we have 29 people voted out of 63, so we'll just make sure everybody's logged in and up and running. And Nicolina has just put the Mentimeter codes and web link in the chat if anybody needs to pick it up.
So I think I shall move on now, Klaus, if that's okay, to the next slide.
If you feel you didn't get your vote counted, there's usually a button you have to press to submit whatever your entry is.
So on this slide, we're just really asking people to define which the category best describes you and your relationship with test guidelines. So up to about 40 people now. Klaus, you just say when you want me to move on. The first 2 questions are really more just to check that people are using Mentimeter, that people are accessing it, and we can.
Yep. Good. Yeah, I think we got a reasonable subsample. We've sampled 2/3 of the population. It must be statistically valid now in terms of the distribution. Please put in the chat to the NEO office if you're having trouble with Menti, and Nicolina will try and help you. So the first theme we're going to go through is understanding how to implement newly generated TGs, which really start with, do the customers want to use them, and how do they get access to them? And we have some slides here from Jordas that Neil will run through in terms of their experiences of this. So if you want to start on that, Neil.
Hi. Yeah, so for this particular one, I sort of tried to answer the questions that Sean sent me. And one of them was sort of, how do we find out about new test guidelines? And from our perspective, it's usually, as a whole, when regulators require them to be done. Not necessarily or having to wait right until a regulation is written or amended. You can usually see, if you keep an eye on discussions and consultations going on, you start seeing some test guidelines being discussed. I know I've just been going through a whole load of information from Caracal from ECHA today, 70 odd documents, and there's quite a lot of discussions about new approach methodologies that are taught, and also new requirements potentially for REACH, where a lot of new guidelines, both for nano for materials and normal substances, are being discussed. So that's some of them. It's the first time I've heard of them looking through these documents, but definitely when the regulation gets required. You can find out about them if you're part of a project. So hence, keep an eye on NanoHarmony, get to find out about new projects if you're part of them, but that probably limits it down to quite a lot. Obviously, if big companies like BASF, I suspect, get an idea of what's happening rather quicker than everyone else, because they're on the projects and they've got their own labs and have a lot of people to go and keep an eye on this, I suspect, although I might be putting words into Karen's mouth there. So that's sort of how we found out about it. Talking about how they implemented, this is an area that it's a slight different area, but I think it's very important for regulations, is especially in Europe, is once a test guideline becomes a requirement of a regulation, is that under REACH, you submit the data using a robust study summary, which is not the full study report. It's the highlights. It's, as I said, a study summary, including all the important data. For a new test guideline, this is done through originally OECD harmonized template. I'm not exactly certain about the procedure, but I think it probably does an existing one, can it be applied or adapted for a new study, or does a new one have to be written? And then someone writes this template that sort of tells people what data needs to be put into a robust study summary and where. And one thing I'm a little bit unclear about is how is this done? And I'd be interested about, say, from the NanoHarmony people who are writing these new test guidelines, is, do you know how this is done? Is it the people who design the studies who actually write the templates, or is it a separate set of people? Is it the regulators? And how is it ensured that the information in there is easy to extract out of full study reports, and is the information that the regulators need to actually make their final decisions?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Neil. And we'll see if you put words into Karen's mouth. She's got the next slide.
Okay, I think I also try to answer the questions on how to understand when there is a new test guideline implemented or developed. And I think we are really in a luxury situation at BASF that we make our own method developments, which we bring to OECD, though we have some knowledge how to bring studies to OECD into the OECD process. Then we have scouting. I think people coming to us with informing us. Then very often, since we have a big lab, that we're asked just to participate in ring trails, so-called round robins. Then we always try to be, because we have a lot of chemicals, not only nanomaterials, so we really try to be involved in the guideline development, because it's very important to us to learn on an early stage what guidelines are developed, which labs we will need in the future. And I think very late we also know about the regulatory requirements. So this is the final step when everybody should know there is a new guideline available. The second question was, do regulators generally accept results from using test guidelines, or is there still requests for more information? In general, since these are OECD test guidelines, they are accepted by regulators. Sometimes regulators just think they are not completed, though they ask for further tests or further information added to the tests. What we also learn from chemicals, that I think the OECD guideline process is already for a few decades that test guidelines get outdated and that even animal tests are not accepted by regulators anymore when they were performed, I think, for example, 20 years ago using an older test guide. A very prominent example is the Ames test, which is the bacterial reverse mutation assay. In the past, it was only that it's really now asking for more strains. Now 5 strains are needed, not only 4, which was in the past. So they really ask us to repeat the test. And this is more or less what I can tell to this first point.
Excellent, thank you very much. So now we'll have a vote of everybody to see if your experiences are the same. Obviously, some of us have never commissioned one, never done one, will never commission one. So there's an option there, which many might fall into. The interesting bit, I guess, is the people that can answer the 2 left-hand side questions and the proportion between those. So while this builds up, does anybody out there have a question, an answer to Neil's question about where the templates come from? Are they generated as part of the standard being produced, or is it something that is generated through a process after the standard's produced?
I think at OECD there's a working group dealing with this OHTs. And I think we will, I'm not involved in this, but I know that they really work together also with ECHA and other also with US EPA, I think, and then those standards are developed. And of course, we within ECHA, we have to use Euclid and for submitting the data. And I think these are not one-to-one usually, and it's very interesting just with the new methods, alternative approaches, how they will be incorporated. But usually it takes some time, and then yes, you know how to incorporate them.
Excellent. So they are developed by the OECD
Yeah.
after the standard is finished.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And we're nearly up to the 40 kind of respondents that we had. So we can see that whilst I totally agree with Karin that the intention is that it should be acceptable data given it's come out of an OECD standards. I'd be interested in hearing from any of the 10 that says no, they usually request more information and data, and what those issues are that are not covered by delivering to the OECD standard. So I don't know who has a comment on that. Johan?
I've got one. I mean, we've had the experience more than once when a regulator, you follow a test guideline, but you also have to, and I'll elaborate this on more on the next section. Additional work is required for nanoforms, which are not formally part of the test guideline, and then there's questions about the validity of the tests or the sample preparation because of the fact that they're nanomaterials, and whether the test is performing accurately for the nanoform.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Neil?
I actually had a bit of trouble answering this one. Firstly, if the test is done absolutely perfectly, then yes, there are no requests. But clearly, if anything is not quite done properly, then you move to no, they request more data if you have your study actually looked at during an evaluation. But there are some test guidelines where you have options to include, say, satellite groups, especially some of the toxicity tests, where maybe in the actual registration, you have perhaps done the test at the bare minimum to just go and meet the obligations. But then when a substance goes to evaluation, the regulators want to know certain issues, perhaps a neurotoxicity or some immunology, where you perhaps have to go and not necessarily repeat, but actually go and generate more data out of that. That's a potential one. So it's when I said no, that's because it may be 1 out of 30. Yeah, they did have to come back, but I think that's the more interesting one.
Yeah, I agree with that. That kind of goes with Fleming's comment in the chat as well. Kai?
Yeah, kind of on the same thing is there's kind of like a fourth option here for me is that even if you've done, depending on the regulation that you're in, even if you've done your test and it meets all the criteria and it's valid, if there's a specific concern and it's part of an integrated testing strategy, it doesn't mean that it might not trigger more information. So I think more specifically, it's like it won't trigger more information necessarily directly on this endpoint, but potentially on other endpoints, even if it's done to a test guideline. But obviously the idea is like you said, it's mutual acceptance of data, and so long as you can tick all the boxes, it should be accepted.
Yeah. So there's nothing. It's not the guidelines as such that aren't complete enough. It's the fact that the data they generate isn't all the data that would be needed for that particular question. Ricky, you had your hand up and then took it down again, or?
Yes, maybe just to add on what is said already. I mean, especially for nanomaterials, there is a lot of guidance documents, and they need to be considered as well. And if they are not considered, then of course the results of a test guideline are not enough for nanomaterials, because the test guideline often is based on chemicals in general. So often there is additional analytics needed, station of the nanomaterial during the test duration. So if this is not considered, then of course there might be some additional requests afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. And Fred, your comment in the chat suggests that there's some feedback cycle going on between different registrations. Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, everyone's talking confidentially to the regulator. So the regulator may know of another company's claim about the solubility or the toxicity that you haven't addressed, or they've raised that sort of issue, and they sometimes hint at that situation in their questions to you. They won't tell you who did it, but they will say, we have a question, you need to do more, and they might ask for a different benchmark material to be used. They are tying these things together, so you're fighting with another company, you don't know who it is you're punching, and vice versa.
Okay, cool. But the guidelines themselves can really help on that, or would that be sort of a more dynamic set of guidance documents that goes around it?
It would be the basis for them asking an additional question, or to add a different benchmark, or to comment on something that's in a literature article as a part of the elaboration. So it could be in the explanation, or it could be a second round of testing that does something else, different pH than the normal guideline. Yeah. But I think the TG serves as a communication device for what were otherwise secret conversations that you don't know who was involved in.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I will take Joanne's reply to Fleming if you want to elaborate on that, or do you think it's covered in the chat, Joanne? You're okay, good. Right, well, that was spot on 15 minutes. I think the next one will be the long one, so unless there's some burning issues for this one. Kai, is that an old hand, or?
Yeah, that's not one, just about
okay, cool, no worries. So if we move on to the next theme, which I think maybe potentially longer in terms of the availability and how we make that happen. So this is about, it's all fine us making very elegant and complicated test guidelines, but if it means they're so expensive to run that no companies take it up in terms of setting them up to be run, then they get hard to access in terms of using for testing. And that's kind of what we want to explore in this theme. And Ricky, you got the first sort of briefing slide on this?
Yes, so I like selected two studies which I focused on, considering some of the points, which are for nanomaterials really important. So it's very specific, but I hope that it could be used for other guidelines under development, or maybe future guidelines as well. For example, for the dispersion stability, there is like a lot of, I don't want to say that it is possible to make it better, but there should be some considerations on some aspects, because for the development of guidelines, usually I think some model substances are used. So very prominent models of a nanomaterial, for example. But there is a variety of materials which can be then difficult to test afterwards. For example, if you have like particles for dispersion stability with a very low mass, for example, and also the size of a particle plays a role when it comes to transferring particle number to mass concentration. And if we have in the end a low mass concentration, it could be very difficult to measure it. That's just one point, which is which I come across often when running this test guideline, for example. And another thing is often I think in the past it was often that test guidelines were like planned around working day or working week. But especially this guideline is quite a lot of work to set up and to run in normal working hours. So that's not a problem at universities, of course, but to be done in a laboratory or in industry, it could be really tough to like set up a test and run it and do all the samplings. For the extended test of dispersion stability, this could really like be 12 hours or something, depending on the complexity of the test substance, for example, and some other points. And of course, in case of this guideline, I think the price could be really, really high. It could be also dependent a lot on the test item. So if it is a material which needs to be measured with ICP-MS, for example, and needs to be pre-treated like acid digestion or something. And for the extended test, we have like 380 samples. That's really an amount which is costly in the end. And the test guideline as well says, for example, it's very specific. I hope it's okay if I go into detail. But the test guideline as well says if the particle is dissolving during this time, then it also the dissolved fraction to be tested with ICP-MS. This means even doubling the sample number in the end. And we need to use membrane filtration to have the dissolved fraction. This means I need more than 380 membrane devices, which are really costly. So in the end, if I make an offer for a client, this could be not possible to to be successful when I consider all these points in advance. And of course, from my point of view, the guideline is relatively complex. It's doable, but I think there is some experience with nanomaterials required. If you are like a standard lab, it could be really tough to run this test guideline if you are not used to dispersing nanomaterials and doing analytics for nanomaterials in general. And of course, nanomaterials, we treat it as a special group, but it's also a very broad group. And that makes it complex to develop guidelines, especially for this material, because it's not a metal, it's also not a molecule. It could be both, and it could be even more than that. Yeah. That's just, I don't know how to cope with it, but maybe the model substances need to be selected more broadly. I know that the development costs of the guideline will increase as well, but I think if you just run a guideline round robin with 3 nanomaterials, and one is a metal and one is a metal oxide, then a lot of nanomaterials will not be covered within this round robin, like organic pigments, which can be nanomaterial. Also, some molecules are considered nanomaterials, all the carbon nanomaterials like carbon nanotubes and so on. And all these are really, really special to test, and that makes it difficult also to develop a guideline which can be used for all these particles. I fully understand the problem, but in the end, labs and also the be of high importance. The order of mixing things, like putting nanomaterial in a media before adding natural organic matter or afterwards, or steering all the time or steering after you add it, can be really change the particle size and everything. So, and then the outcome of the study as well. So that's basically on a guideline which is maybe done already, and I think it was published in 2017. But we had first requests, I think 2019, and first studies on this guideline 2019, with increasing numbers now, of course.
Yeah.
So next slide, please.
It's already there. Yeah.
And that's dissolution rate. I think it's a guideline which is under development still, but it is also a study which is requested today. So that makes it especially difficult for laboratories, because we need to offer a study which can be used and which is fitting the requests of authorities. And we have only the information we get from NanoHarmony, for example, or from some experts working on the development of these guidelines. And of course, the medium plays an important role when somebody is talking about dissolution and also dissolution rate. I don't know if it's possible, but it might be helpful to have maybe also I don't know how to cope with it, but if there are requests on a test, there should be a guideline available which can be used properly. Because if not, then a lot of points, which I also had on this slide or have on this slide, need to be selected by a lab or by the regulator. Yeah. So and that could be the best scientific work, and nobody knows if it is what will be later in the guideline. Mm. Of course, the membrane, the size of the membrane, the pores is important. General ultrafiltration, which should be used for this study, is really expensive nowadays. And also like this kind after membrane filtrations for separating particles from ions is like a point which is which needs to be considered. And of course, things like organic nanomaterials, how should they be treated within this study, because a molecule will not dissolve in any form. Is the guideline just not applicable, or what? There are requests for this study for molecules. What we had in the past is that we have like test items which consist of multiple elements, and they might not behave the same. So from my point of view, this needs to be considered during the development of a guideline. And also, it's very specific. I hope if we apply a nanomaterial to kind of this study, if it's a batch study, then how should it be treated before? That's a point which needs to be considered. And until all these points are clear, I think we are in a space where we don't have a guideline, which is even worse than a guideline, which is not perfect. So a lot of variation might be possible. And if all these points are considered, then we have the advantage that we at least minimize the variations between labs, and maybe to come to a point where the outcome is comparable in the end. And that's, I think, the main task of a guideline. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And I think a lot of these things are expected to be picked up in the ring testing before it was ratified, but we can get back to how we deal with things that weren't picked up and how we would like to feed them back in. Karen, if you want to go through yours.
Yes, I can quickly go through these points. Though the question was more or less, which barriers do you find when using test guidelines? And I think what is very important that I think industry is acting globally, that they are really accepted worldwide, and we have to prevent double testing. This is especially true when we talk about animal tests, but also for other testing, I think it's always difficult changing the method, getting conflicting results, and you really then start to question the reliability of the results you get in the various demands from the authorities. And what we find out that a lot of tests more or less have only a very narrow domain where you get reliable results. And so there must be really clear which chemicals or which materials are within the domain of such a new test guideline. Then the other aspect is really the technical experience. I think we are now dealing with different materials, not chemicals anymore, but it's also true for chemicals, but for with nanomaterials, there is of course the need of experience of the lab performing such a test, and also the evaluation and interpretation of the results. This should be given when you provide a test guideline. And the last point is just, I think it was mentioned by Ricky and others before, I think it's really the technical equipment. Partly there is very sophisticated technical equipment needed, which might be available in academia, but not at CROs. And just for a special class of chemicals or materials, it's always very difficult to find then a CRO, which is in favor to achieve, to get such technical equipment. And also the training, working with those materials is very important. And with all this, these are costs which might be increase the testing.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And last entry here is Neil from Jordas again.
Okay, I'll try and be as quick as possible. So this is actually based on feedback I've got from partners, colleagues in Jordas as well as myself. I should quickly point out that none of these have arisen from us talking to either Geica or Nicotox, and you might be getting some emails from us. So the more general sort of the big testing houses. And first one was just a shortage of testing houses that actually offer these studies, especially on nanomaterials. I think it once again comes back to the fact of the actual capital investment that's perhaps required just for a study that might only be needed once or twice a year. And is it even economically viable for the big testing houses to buy in the equipment? When we've talked to some of these testing houses, some of them have never even heard of the study, which can be a bit disconcerting. Tends to mean we go to someone else straight away. But others not quite certain, although they might have heard of it, not quite certain what's required. I say there is a certain level of expertise that is required for these studies to understand the intricacies of nanomaterials. Expensive, and also a big variety in cost. We had a study looking at the dissolution of, or two ones, one of a standard metal oxide, another of a carbon-based nanomaterial. For the metal oxide, we were getting, for this dissolution aggregation study, around about £20,000 quoted. For the carbon-based one, we varied from about 10,000 to about 70,000, which instantly made us think, is this study really that good for this sort of substance? Which is a testing house is either not understanding what they need to do, or are they wanting to do more than they actually need to do? So it just made us think there's issues with this. We're a bit disconcerted, and this led on to so what I call the testing house ecosystem, where you've got labs that do specialize in one particular area. So I mean, one does ecotox, one does phys chem. Just getting the information that's required for one study being fed back sort of from the original study almost. And I'll discuss that in the next topic. So maybe I'll gloss over that final bullet point and talk about it in the next one, Klaus.
Excellent. Thank you, Neil. And before we start, well, we can start the voting here, but Joanne had a few comments to make here on these points as well.
I did. Thanks, Klaus. You know, I think in two categories, and some of these points have been made already. One is about the nano-specific aspects of characterizing materials before you put them into a TG test, and commercial laboratories often not having either the equipment or the expertise or the knowledge about how to do that characterization work, and having to go, you know, we've had to go to academic laboratories to have them characterize the materials that are being tested in a GLP lab, which means that the characterization work is not GLP, which becomes problematic. So there's a need there to make sure that part gets fit in. And with the discussion of the specialization, that does get really complicated. For example, we've been working with organic and other carbon-based nanomaterials, and particularly with the organic nanomaterials, being able to measure them. Even in air is very challenging because they're simply carbohydrate molecules, but once you get them into any kind of biological or environmental media, then finding them is enormously challenging. Labeling is also similarly challenging, ensuring that the labels don't have any impact on, say, a toxicological endpoint or other physical or chemical characteristic. So it's there are significant challenges, and the last one being that I wanted to make sure to raise was about high aspect ratio materials, that many of the tests are developed for spherical particles, and so when you get to the higher aspect ratio, that gets even more challenging to figure out how to quantify and characterize. And such that some of the endpoints that are requested aren't even really relevant for some of the materials, and that's not always clarified in the domain. Okay.
Excellent, thank you. Amaya?
Yes, so just Joanne said something that I completely agree, and is that sometimes as service providers, we are asked to perform an assay under GLP. And sometimes we have to reject that because it's impossible, for example, to be able to quantify the nanomaterial. And specifically, I'm talking about skin absorption, for example. It's very difficult to keep the balance and to do it under GLPs and fulfill all the criteria that the guideline asks you to do. So sometimes we have to say, no, we can do this under GLP because we cannot quantify this because we don't know how to do it, or the methodology is not described enough. So yeah, that's an important point. And regarding what Ricky said, we don't do the physical chemical characterization of the nanomaterials. We usually, unless we are within a project where you do research, so you can try and different assays and change some things. So that's, you have time and you usually have more money. But if you have to provide a service, we usually what we get is the nanomaterial. And especially if it's a small company, they don't have the structure or the technical capacity of giving all this dispersion stability or these dissolution rates. So we have to deal with that before doing the assay. And it's difficult to find someone to ask like a technical support or something in these guidelines, you don't know if you have doubts of doing, you have to apply the nanomaterial to the surface of a skin, and you don't know how to do it right. Sometimes we have to do it like, okay, let's do this and see if it works, because we don't know if we're doing it right or wrong, because we have no one to ask. So
it would be handy to have a kind of user panel website forum where you could share experiences, even if some of the solutions might be slightly commercially in confidence, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's really good. Thank you. Kai?
Yeah, I kind of echo whatever else is said. I think there's still, with the test guidelines, and because of the complications of nanoforms or nanomaterials in general, there's this really high level of expertise that's needed to be able to produce something that is robust. And I think, you know, sometimes there's almost too many options in them, too many directions that you can go, which is the reason why we require that expertise. And you know, trying to, especially with some of the test guidelines that we have said are appropriate for nanomaterials, and we've got some guidance documents in and around them. So if we go, for example, for an OECD 476, which is a genotox study in vitro, I think it's very hard for the labs as well as some of the SMEs and things to keep up with the particular adaptations and also the adaptations that are wanted by the regulators on these tests. So for the OECD 476, it's basically they're asking for analytical data for the nanomaterials, which you usually wouldn't get for normal chemicals. And that includes sort of the dissolution characterization, not just before, but also during, which in one of my instances has almost doubled the cost of the test, which, as you can imagine, would price some people out. But also, because we need that extra analytical stuff on that side of nanomaterial characterization, it's also extremely difficult to find a lab that not only has the capability to do the toxicology side of things, but also then subsequently the characterization, and usually they're having to outsource exactly what everyone else is saying. They're having to outsource that to someone else, whether it be GLP or not. And I think, you know, one of the other major issues that I've come across is that a lot of these guidelines are set up for nanoforms that are pure, you know, your silver, your zinc oxide, not even metal compounds or just metals. So when it comes to a metal compound and we've got, say, a dispersion stability study, it's like, well, do we need to measure each metal within the compound? Or do we just measure one? You know, I've recently had a test back where in a compound, one part of the material is coming back and saying that it is not stable, and the other part of the compound is saying that it is stable, but we also know that it's not dissolving. So there's no real answer as to why that's happening. So I think these things haven't been fully addressed in the guidelines, and obviously that's partly because of the complexities and partly because of how the ring testing and the popular materials that we have always studied, because we wanted to develop this understanding first before we went to the more complex ones.
Yeah. So that kind of goes back to what Karen was saying about domains and it being really clear what this has been made available and testing is supposed to be for. But then I guess there's again an issue of how do we feed back that now actually the needs, the evidence needs are there for other materials as well, and how do we then get a quick update of the guidance in terms of how do we run a test for these new materials? And I can totally see your issue with, you know, how do you get a test lab to run the test and then also run real-time characterization of dissolution in samples as you go through that test, which Ricky also mentioned. We're running slightly out of time. I knew this one was going to be the long one. I've seen some of the chat, but we will see if we can get back to that at the end. I think this graph's really quite illustrative that these tests are complicated and there's barriers at all levels. They're probably for different tests, and that would take us another half hour to deconvolute which ones are on what aspects. I think that is the general picture I see, as the speakers have covered as well, is it is highly technical and it's very specific equipment and skills that are needed for certain tests, which means it can be hard to identify labs that run it. And the cost generally is too high compared to what I expect people are used to paying for in normal non-nanochemicals, where the test guidelines are probably simpler. Certainly the characterization is. So thank you very much all for that discussion. We'll come back to the bits in the chat if we have time, but I would like to get through the last two bits as well. So theme 3 is about whether all the testing requirements are covered for nano going forward. Sort of a slightly rhetorical question. The question is really, how do we address it? And Neil's got the first intro slide here. So over to you, Neil.
This probably shows how I interpreted the question slightly different, because I think I'm giving answers that Kai and Karen have already put in different parts. So yeah, it's as we found, as already been said, certain types of nanoforms can be very difficult to actually handle within some of these technical guidances. As I say, organic nanomaterials are very difficult to detect. If we start moving to things like multi-component nanomaterials, if we're looking for, as Kai said, degradation, what form is the what nanoform do you have at the end of the experiment? So it's almost a case of, well, it's needing more guidance about, well, what can this technical guidance do and what can't it do, and make it very clear. Things like what type of potential test studies give confounding or interfering results. So you maybe an in vitro study, if you know beforehand, don't try these particular metals because they interfere with your assay. As long as, if that's very clear, that's good. Then moving on from that, it's sort of taking sort of the broader perspective of doing an overall risk assessment, to say from a part of a regulation, is understanding how results from one technical guideline can impact on how you design a further one. The example here is you generally need to do dissolution or agglomerate behavior is almost a staple to have done before you do any ecotox testing, quite a lot of tox testing, but it's just sort of understanding sort of how do the results from one lead to another, to make sure that the original study actually, you have the results in the form that is needed to design the second. The example I have here is we got asked by a ecotox testing house, well, okay, you're going to do some stability studies of your dispersion in environmental media, but how does the impact of the actual, when we do our ecotox testing, the animals themselves or the flora or fauna actually change the characteristics of the media as they go through? Is that looked at in this dissolution test, or does it need to be looked at? So for the regulatory requirements, it probably doesn't. But if you're needing then to go and design a suitable ecotox testing, or maybe you need to know that before and put little extras onto your technical guidance to ensure you have that information. The final bit is just, I think Karen mentioned, is, and for industry, you don't want to be trying to do studies on a draft method that 2 years, because you have to do it immediately to meet obligations, that 2 years time might change and the regulators may come along and ask you just to repeat it, because that's really expensive. You'd hope not, and I think that's probably more of an issue for the regulators as much as for people designing test guidance, but that's one of the issues that I know we have had with our clients.
Yeah, can appreciate that. Thank you very much. Karen, your entry here.
Yes, I also prepared a slide on this topic, and it's just, are there any gaps in test guidelines that impact your ability to fulfill regulatory requirement? I think within Europe, we have REACH, and REACH was just extended for nanomaterials and nanoforms, and it's very obvious that we need some new test guidelines or adapted test guidelines to fulfill those requirements. So because the current test guidelines are partly not appropriate or not applicable. Nevertheless, I think it's very, very important that we just develop integrated testing strategies, especially when we are dealing with nanoforms. I think it's very important that we really develop the strategy based on physical chemical data and just to allow us to make those assessments. Then the next question is more nanospecific test guidelines are needed to help industry comply with regulatory dossiers for nanomaterials. I think this is always depending on the endpoint. Sometimes there's also only a need for adaptations of test guideline, but I think it's also more important that we really prove that current test guidelines are appropriate for nanomaterials. So we have to prove that their performance is getting towards the correct outcome. So this is also something which is very important. And what would be the regulatory preparedness? And I think this might be very, in an ideal world, I think we would really try to predefine which information is really needed. Before we start with the method, that we really define the method should give me this outcome. And we also have to predefine the combination of methods and testing strategies. I think that, again, we are talking about strategies. And then when we especially go to alternative methods, it's very important that I also define the interpretation procedure for the results of a method or a study. And of course, there should be a coordination within the method development. And but again, it's really important that we have a validation of the guideline development, that we have ring trails, that we show the robustness of a test system. And I think with this, we really need to also step a good cooperation with academia or labs developing test guidelines and the regulators and the people who have to use the test guidelines.
Excellent, thank you. Sean, do you want to just run through this one?
Yes, so what we're asking quickly is whether you think that if there are gaps in the test guidelines that impact your ability to fulfill regulatory requirements now, or if you foresee in the future. And there are some different options there for people to pick.
Yeah, I'm glad I got these glasses on. I hadn't spotted that yesterday when we trialed the slides.
So we've got no gaps against current requirements, or no foreseen gaps against future needs, minor gaps against current requirements, major gaps against current requirements, minor gaps against likely future requirements, or major gaps against current requirements.
And people can choose multiples, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. So, Joanne, others in the panel, any comments to make on that set of slides?
While people are voting, just briefly, because I think we've covered a lot of kind of where the gaps lie and need to be filled in. I do think on regulatory preparedness that, you know, in my experience, which is outside the EU, more so than in the EU, regulators' knowledge can be either limited or dated. Going back to fairly early studies where uncertainty was a huge issue, and of course, you know, you can point to individual studies that raise, you know, certain concerns in their abstract or in their discussion or even in the way the data is presented. But I do think that it would be helpful if there was a way for industry and government to discuss how to do testing, because it's just not fair to ask a startup to be a methods inventor to solve a particular problem, and they don't have the resources that the large companies do, including the industry associations, to support them in coming up with an approach that and being able to present that to the regulatory community. So a better way of interaction would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Kai and then Amaya.
Yeah, I think so far as fulfilling the regulatory requirements, it's important not only to look at the data requirements themselves, but also what they're feeding into, a little bit like other people have already said, for instance, the risk assessment. And sort of on that note, there's a really good example already where we've got the test guideline for the dispersion stability. But if we wanted to do any exposure modeling, fate modeling for the risk assessment, we'd actually need attachment efficiency, and that at the moment isn't part of the test guideline. So it's whether they need to be sort of continually updated. But because we know more now about the direction those things are going, we also have some regulatory process in place. I think it's important as we're producing new guidelines or even looking to adapt old ones, that we look at these regulatory requirements and think, well, what question are we trying to answer? Where does this feed into, and have we covered the bases that we need to with this test guideline? Because otherwise it starts to become quite cumbersome and quite an academic exercise. It's like, well, we have this one test for this part. So a lot of the tests that I'm looking at the moment, they'll only ever answer one question for me, which isn't necessarily an issue, but it's not conventionally what's happened. A water solubility test would have been suitable for your fate models and also for your data requirement, whereas now we don't have the same sort of parallel for a nanomaterial, because you need the water solubility, but you also need the rate constant for the kinetics to feed into the risk assessment. But you can't have both, because you need to reach saturation to get the water solubility, which means that you have to do two different tests, basically to fulfill the risk assessment side or the hazard side, as well as your data requirement side. And that's a constant battle I'm sort of having to discuss and explain to my clients. I'm like, oh, well, it's not usually like that yet, but unfortunately, and I think it's partly just because of the lessons we've learned from the classic chemicals, and I suspect that some of the updates that will come through as the regulation progresses will start to have more stringent requirements on classic chemicals. We've learned so much with nanomaterials that we can apply, that I think it's just making the process much harder, and everything else depends on something else before it. You almost can't do anything without dissolution. For REACH, all of the integrated testing strategies feed into that, yet we don't have a clear idea on what that test guideline is, and I've had discussions in it, so well, you need to fulfill it because it's a requirement and you can't do the other tests anyway after that. So I just think that's quite an important thing to bring up, that these aren't isolated things, they do feed into other things. And I think a little bit on what Karen was saying with the mode of action in AOP, I know there's been focus for NanoHarmony looking at the OECD 442D, which looks at a very specific part of an AOP for skin sensitization, which is great, and we can look at the applicability of it, but even with that one study, we can't do anything with it because we haven't covered the other areas of the adverse outcome pathway. So we need to cover at least 2 of the 4 events, I think it is. At the moment, we would only have 1.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Just before we get to Amaya and then Neil, I am aware, as I've said in chat, that time, this is getting much more interesting than we planned for in an hour and a half, but I hope people can stay on. We'll plan on running it about 10 minutes over, I guess, and hope we get the last bit in as well. This slide has settled out, and I think the discussion has as well. The key bit really is on the next slide, if you want to move on, Sean, where you should be able to type in how you suggest this should be dealt with, because I think what we've heard in this theme is that there are needs for specific guidance to be added to these test guidelines. There's need for them to be rapidly reviewed to be able to meet new materials. Yet you don't want to go through the whole cycle of reviewing, over years, the guideline, and then have old data called out of scope because the guideline is now new and that data was developed under a now then outdated guideline. So Sean, do you want to tell people how to enter their entries here?
Yeah, so simply on the screen that you're using, you should just get a little comment box that you can type your comment into, press submit, and then they should start appearing on the screen.
Yeah, and that really is about that feedback loop. How do we get those new evidence requirements dealt with quickly, whether that's because they are new evidence requirements in new materials or that the new materials don't fit into the current standards for those evidence requirements. And Maya, and then I thought Neil had his hand up as well, but we'll...
Yes, I will be very quick. I just wanted to highlight something that Karin said about integrating testing strategies, because for cosmetics that have nanomaterials within their product, you cannot use animal testing, so you have to do all in vitro or new approach methodologies. And if you take the SCCS guideline, if you have a new nanomaterial, you have to do certain assays that you cannot do them because it maybe involves in vivo assays, and there is not a clear integrated testing strategies for those assays. So I think I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's important in cosmetics field.
Excellent, thank you. Neil?
Hi, just a quick one. I just thinking if any of these test guidelines can be done and run in parallel, where you can actually test different nanoforms roughly at the same time, that would hopefully make things a lot more efficient. Now, I do know that probably is perhaps impossible for certain test guidelines, but if it could be possible to at least examine the possibility of designing it so they can be run in parallel at the start of coming up with test guidelines, that might make it more cost efficient in the long run.
Yeah, it's just the case of then getting that tiered system of which test leads to what afterwards, right from the start, I guess. We've got some comments here that I think are reflecting several aspects of culture. I like the tobacco industry one. It's probably wouldn't have been sensible to ask them what to test to perform because they seem to know the data and then just withhold it. I'm hoping we're way past that kind of ethics in industry by now, but it is probably right that there needs to be a neutral and safe place, a safe environment to have those communications in of we are inventing this, what could the requirements be and how does regulation have to respond to that so that we are regulatory prepared. Karin, do you want to comment on that or anything in particular?
No, I wanted to comment on Neil. I think especially on parallel testing, I think all within regulation we have to work under GLP. And this is usually causing a huge problem then when you just test materials in parallel.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so SMEs need better access to the development. Initial meetings, workshops, support channel. Yeah. Neutral body. So we are getting to this sort of trusted environment being needed where you can raise questions about how to run things, but also about suggesting modifications. Is there an argument of you as test providers and industry delivering needs to regulators being able to, and I know this is difficult with ECHA at least, but I don't know how it is in the US, be able to say, well, we foresee these problems with this evidence requirement, running to this standard, we can't also do this bit, but we think the most important question, a bit like Kai said earlier, this is the actual essence of the question that we're trying to address. So we'll do these parts of the guideline, but we can't do that full parallel in time characterization of dissolution or whatever goes on or should be going on alongside. Is that even feasible in your experiences to have those discussions with regulators, or is it just you meet this, you submit it, and you cross your fingers you've crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's? Fred?
Yeah, Klaus, my impression based on US experience and a little bit of Europe is that the regulators currently make their decisions by identifying an analog, and they compare you to that analog. And if the analog hasn't caused any problems, your testing is sufficient because you aren't going in a bad direction. However, if you're going towards NAMs and IATA and so forth, you have to now have a different level of testing. So I think the discussion for the next titanium dioxide that's nano is probably easier than trying to come up with avoiding the 90-day inhalation test with a NAM. And so a different forum is involved, a different way of questions. And it's almost like ECHA has to, or EPA has to realize they need your help, Klaus, before any real movement will occur.
Right. Yeah. Because I'm guessing, you know, they're faced with a, well, not a service level agreement, but sort of, you know, of having to digest data that isn't as perfect for the purposes that it's intended to be as it could have been if there was more flexibilities within the system.
And I just want to follow up. The EPA allows you to, and when it's a molecule, allows you to identify what the analog is most likely, so that you can make the analog your argument point. In the area of particles, you can't do that currently. So we're in a situation again that's new territory, and hence I think a neutral forum that's more academically oriented, but maybe the JRC comes along as something to work with.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the forum we've had or have in NanoHarmony as well. That it is, well, by virtue of being a CSA action, it's not a research project as such. It is kind of a forum of generating community debate, but it probably needs, as you say, a more long-term home somewhere. Okay, we will take all these notes away and see what we can come up with from them in suggestions that we then put back out when we probably most likely present this to the OECD and the WPM and NMP meeting in Paris in June. Good. Okay. Shall we move on to the next bit, Sean? So theme 4 is, how do we encourage new tests to be developed if and when they're needed? I kind of think we covered a lot of that in the we need that forum. But we do have a few entry slides here just to spark off the last debate. Neil first.
Yeah, so industry encouraging new tests to be developed. I guess if and when it would be a need. I think there's an encouragement when a new test developed is also knowing when an existing one doesn't work. And isn't performing well, and I'm not quite sure whether there is a feedback. Who needs to know about this? How do they get to know about it? I presume it's the OECD, but I don't know what the framework for allowing that to be done. And when a new test guideline is needed, why is it needed, and when is it going to be needed? I think those are the two things that I thought that industry could be able to, if they can give feedback, that's where they could. Yeah,
excellent, thank you. And Karen?
I also, again, I try to answer the questions, and does industry have a good input into the development of a new test guideline or suggesting amendments to already existing test guideline? And I think this question can really not be answered in general. I think it depends very much on which kind of industry, and I think partly it's not so easy. But in principle, these are the well-known options, how you can influence as industry also the development of a test guideline. It's first the participation in national and international research projects. I think very often, I think academia and research projects develop new ideas, new test guidelines. And if you participate in those projects, of course, you get the knowledge that there might be a good method developed. There is, of course, a cooperation with international experts. I think this is very important to know what are the current state of science. Then you should participate in organization and scientific workshops like this one. I think then you might also learn what's going on, where is research going on in developing a new guideline. And when you are at OECD level, you can also participate via BIAC and get also your contribution via BIAC. But there are also bottlenecks, so predefining the performance needs of a new method. I think this is, always a problem. Having matching methods also just when to address an AOP. I think AOP is maybe one of the future needs for assessing materials and substances. But I think this is also this AOPs have to develop, and I think it's very important also the domain has to be defined. And very important is really also the validation and having sufficient reference data. I think this was mentioned earlier, but I don't know by whom, but I think it's not really to have tested only a metal and a metal oxide. I think it's very important that you really have tested an appropriate appropriate number of materials with different properties. And even I think I was really pushing very hard for validation. I think we have to, I still believe it's extremely important that we really have valid method which give precise results. We have to work on how those processes get just shorter, because currently it's taking years. So this were my final thoughts.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, the validation step is long, but it sort of comes into the, maybe you can have a short validation for a certain domain, but then we could validate that test guideline for another domain in this, and then it could be qualified for that with a slightly different test guidance document around it. So this is a slight, well, it's not a trick question, but it's one to perhaps motivate the OECD to become more flexible. So if you have choices as users out there, have you got a preference for using the OECD test guidelines, even if they are a slower system to get the tests from, or is it preferable to pick up a faster generated ISO or SEN test, or is the OECD test just so much more powerful because of the MAD concept? And I think we're getting a reasonably clear answer to that, so that's good. We'll see if we can get to the 20 that are sort of answering questions about this, or whether we've lost some people already. We've lost a few. I think the answer is probably fairly clear either way, even if another 5 people voted, Sean. So there we go. Yeah, thank you for that. And another thing for industry, just how do you make these decisions? Is it based around the best relation to the evidence you have to do, and cost is a minor consideration, or is cost and availability really quite important as well, as long as it sufficiently meets the evidence requirements? Okay. So cost and availability clearly does play quite a part in this. Okay. See if there's another. Is there another 4? Okay. Let's see if we can get to the 15 that we're voting before. Okay, I guess another 2 wouldn't sway the balance anyway. So thank you for that. And the last question is, do you think that currently industry has a positive influence on the adaptation and creation of OECD test guidelines? How you know, as Karin said, you feed in through BIAC and there are other ways, or is it really difficult to do? Okay. At least nobody's saying no, which is good. Okay. And while people are voting, Amaya, you had a comment?
Yes, regarding the comparing OECD or ISO.
Yeah.
Well, OECD is free.
Yeah.
And one of the comments was, if you are choosing ISO depending on the evidence requirements, but you really don't know the requirements until you buy the guidelines. So sometimes when it's a new one, I'm familiar. I'm not very familiar with ISO in general, but I'm very familiar with the biological evaluation of medical devices.
Mm-hmm.
And the new ones, the new guidelines that appear, like last year came the in vitro irritation test for medical devices. So I'm used to perform this kind of test. So it was good for us to have that ISO. So we bought it. But it is something punctual or something that is not very asked, or we don't get asked very usual. And we just want to see how we have to perform this test. We have to buy it.
Yeah.
And moreover, I remember with the genotoxicity test, for medical devices, again, I'm sorry, I'm not talking about nanomaterials, but it's like an example. The genotoxicity test for medical devices, you can do the AIMS test, and they put the OECD 471, which is the guideline that you have to follow. But then they say that modified for medical devices. And to see that supplement, you have to buy it also. So,
yeah. I
mean, for me, I would choose OECD guidelines just for a cost reason.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of getting the guideline, it was more whether there's also a cost of running more complex things, I guess. Thank you, Amaya. That was really useful. Neil?
Yeah, just for the first 2 questions, I'd have to say that one thing is that a lot depends on what the regulators want you to do. It's just sort of making a choice of would I choose OECD or ISO? It depends on what the regulators tell me, and as they tend to tell you OECD, then it would be OECD. I think that's what Fred said a little bit in his chat message. Secondly, do you choose the best one or the one that's the cheapest that just gives you enough information? Once again, what's the regulator's perspective on this? Have they given recommendations? Do they say this is the best one we'd prefer you to use? Or do they say you can use any of these 3 and we'll be happy with them? So from my perspective, I'd always like to know what the regulator's perspective, if you're using it for a regulatory purpose.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Mary?
Hi. I think because I serve in both OECD and ISO, Amaya is right. You have to buy the test guidelines or whatever from ISO. But the thing is, with the OECD, it's binding. The regulators, you must do this type of tests. But then when it comes to ISO, it's voluntary. And that's the way we use it in South Africa. One is binding and the other one is voluntary. Okay. It's quite good, the ISO, they produce all this. which contributes to all these test guidelines and all the rest, and that's the distinction between the two.
Excellent, thank you. Anybody else before? I'm terribly sorry about running over, but it was really interesting. Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the speakers. If you want to move to the last slide, we can tell you when the next installment happens. It'll be around the end of the month. We are hoping it'll be on the 30th of March, but we are just confirming the speakers for that. If you go and tick the newsletter, you will obviously get it. You might have ticked it already when you're registered for this one. Otherwise, Sean will send out, or Nicolina will, the Survey Monkey, where you can put in anything that comes up after this has sort of digested in your mind a little bit, I guess. And also the Survey Monkey is there for people that watch the recording later and wants to give their feedback, because they obviously can't do it in the Mentimeter like we did. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for your feedback and your preparations for today. I found it very educational to see a part of it that I've got very little experience of myself. And I think looking at the 50% of academics that were here when we started, they probably also got a better appreciation for why sometimes the review and commenting rounds come back with things you don't quite appreciate as a scientist. It seems constrained and contrived, but it now makes it a little bit more sense. I think the other thing is there is a need for how we construct a faster feedback loop in this, and how we cover that domain issue of it's now ratified for these particles. For these particles here, you will need to do it differently, and whether that can be covered with some kind of faster rotation guidance documents being generated around those. Plus, I think the other thing that Amaya mentioned was some kind of mutual help desk where at least issues can be pointed out and maybe regulators can come up with preferred solutions to it. So excellent. Thank you very much all, and hopefully see you again at the end of the month. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.